development or shader development or making textures. Now, there's a couple of ways we can do it. We can either do it, using image-based stuff. So you can apply an image. So here's like a VR project, and I've got some images on the cardboard boxes of the floor and whatnot. Also the walls. But you can also create what's called procedural textures. So this orange is all procedural. It's just using noise maps and bump maps and specular maps to create the image. This chair is all procedural. So again, it's just using noise, and it's all done inside of Maya using like shader development. So you create sort of different render nodes, things like noise patterns, but then you combine them together using either layer nodes or compositing nodes, and it's a bit like Photoshop, but inside of the 3D program. So what we're doing today is kind of introducing you to this procedural texture sort of method. I'll get out of here. So yeah, I'm really into procedural textures. It's kind of had a bit of a renaissance, where it dropped. It was the only way to create textures for a long time in 3D. But then image-based textures came in, and people were very excited about that. And it's been a focus on image-based textures. But up until recently, there's now been a shift to procedural textures. So the benefit of a procedural texture is you can change it dynamically. And you can also apply it to different objects and get sort of different effects. And the scaling, there's no scaling issues in regards to, because it's dynamic, you don't have to worry about baking it out to a particular size. Having said all that, working with a procedural base and then turning it into an image and then adjusting that image in Photoshop is also a really good method of creating textures. So yeah, for example, this Halloween pumpkin is all procedural. So I'll show you the graph. It's pretty full on. So they can get quite big, but basically we start off with like noise patterns, and then we use like adjustments using remap color nodes. So if you've ever done any Photoshop, levels, it's basically like levels or curves in Photoshop. You can adjust the contrast and color range. And then there's like little compositing nodes. So you add two layers together and use blend modes like, multiply or add or subdivide. And that gets, sort of creates this rather big shader node. And this one's quite complicated. But what we're getting is these little noise patterns. We're getting like another noise pattern of the orange and some yellow coming through. But also I'm using, in this case, some curvature nodes, which works out where the curvature of the object is, and then I can mask one color from another, which gives that sort of effect. So what else have we got here? Yeah, you can also use this sort of stuff to create texture or detail. So this is using what's called a deformer or deformation, and we're using noise patterns still and combining them together to create all this extra detail. All right. So that's kind of, the end goal. But starting out, it's one of those topics that, a graduate who's working on Game of Thrones at Big Visual Effects Studio once mentioned to me that they wish they knew more about procedural shader development when they were starting out. So it's one of those topics that is, it's hard to get into at the start, but once you start to understand what's going on, it becomes more and more easy. But it's something that people often will bypass due to the ease of creating image-based textures and that sort of stuff. But the other big advantage of procedural textures is that programs like Substance Designer and Substance Painter have really made procedural textures, super popular, and they have some amazing tools and amazing presets and stuff like that. So, a lot of people will get into the procedural stuff and move to those sort of programs for texturing. However, there's a few basics that we kind of want to understand what's going on. And so basically, the first thing to understand is how the texture is applied to the object. And there's two main methods. There's a 2D placement or a 3D placement. And I'll explain those terms a little bit later on. So this is kind of like a nice example of a procedural texture, and you kind of can really see the makeup of how this is being done. So basically, we've got a ramp. So a ramp is just another name for a gradient, and so we're going from a dark color to this yellow color, and that is going all the way up to the top, and that's also masking this noise pattern underneath. So with the bits of yellow coming through. So we've got two textures there, and as well as that, we've got this fine noise over the top, that giving you the little bit of bump and specular around the edges. So all together, combined together, it creates this really nice effect. Here's a snow pattern. So again, we've got a noise pattern that's actually displacing the texture, so it's making it go up and down, as well as some bump value with extra noise. And then we've also got like this little highlights everywhere, which is a really clamped down similar noise value, giving that sort of little bit of reflection. It really helps to sell it as snow. So here's an image from a pretty old movie now, but it really demonstrates, where these sort of textures are used and how they're used. So for the main characters, we've got lots of custom textures and that sort of stuff, but we do have some procedural stuff going on. So I've just noticed the arm down here. We've got like a little noise pattern on that copper sort of elements. But then there's a lot of painting going on and a lot of extra detail. So like chipping off the edges of the stuff, adding some rust. Again, this all could be done procedurally, but with some painting and fine tuning and whatnot. But the background, you can really see the basic procedural textures, and it's really just used, to break up the surface. So we've got some bump value, which gives you a bit of detail, and we've got some specular color as well, a specular value, which is basically another word for shiny. And we've also got the color values. So with those three things, we can really mimic different surfaces. So we've got some rust happening and all sorts of stuff going on in the background. So this sort of background stuff is what we're going to explore today, and I'll show you how we can make this quite easily, and then how you could adapt that for different surfaces and objects. So the way we do this is utilizing different noise patterns. Now, inside of Maya, we've got a whole range of different noise patterns. And as I sort of mentioned before, there's two sort of, placements. There's the 3D placement, which is basically like a volume. So I think of it as a gas, and I'll demonstrate this when we get into the program a bit more. The other thing to keep in mind is that Hardware 2.0 only supports a certain amount of nodes, and I should find the list. I'll put that list in our notes if I haven't got it there already. Now, if it doesn't support it, what it will do is it will bake out the procedural texture into an image, and I can show you how that works in a second. So these textures here are good textures to use that don't require baking. So if you just keep note of this and refer back to the PDF, so volume noise, solid fractal, marble are three really good ones that are in the 3D placement nodes. So the benefit of a 3D placement node is you don't need a UV map. So a UV map is a unwrapping of the surface, and we're going to get into UV mappings next week. Alternatively, there's 2D placement nodes. And these are good ones as well. So fractal, again, they're without baking, so they don't need baking. Now, what is baking? Basically, yeah, as I said, it turns it into an image, right? Now, in Hardware 2.0 settings, so if you go into the settings under baking resolution for unsupported texture types, it will show you that the texture size is set to 64 pixels by 64 pixels. So you get a really blurry looking texture. So if your computer can handle it, you can increase these to 512 or something like that. I wouldn't go any higher than 512 by 512, and yeah, you'll get a nice clearer texture. So materials. Well, how it works is we start with a base material and then we apply either a procedural texture or an image-based texture, and then that's called a shader. So some of the base materials, these are the more common ones. So we've got Lambert, Blinn, and Phong. Uh, the two that we have to worry about is just Blinn or Lambert. So in today's class, I want you to work out which objects would need a Lambert and which objects need a Blinn. Now, the way you do that is anything that is a matte material and hasn't got any specular highlights or shininess to it can be a Lambert. Anything that has some shininess to it can be a Blinn. Now, if we were using ray tracing and these types of shaders, then if something was transparent, we could use a Phong. You get better sort of results with that, or anastrophic. And anastrophic just means like brushed metal or a CD, something with grooves on it that sort of bend the light. Aluminium is also something that would use something like that. So these are non-physical based materials. And once we get into the program, I'll show you some the physical based stuff as well. But I just recommend you work in Hardware 2.0 and that you work with these non-physical based materials because they're more supported in the Hardware 2.0, and there's everything is more visible. Now these materials have been around since the 1970s, so they've been used consistently. Physical-based materials are something that is relatively new, and they work better with offline renderers like Arnold that are physical-based rendering systems. Now, that's not to say that these materials aren't being used. So they're often used in mobile phone games a lot, and anything that you want to make it sort of more efficient, basically. So the reason why it's efficient is it's actually simulating the bouncing of light on the object. So it's actually not a highlight of reflecting actual light. It's just a change in the gradient to make it look like there's a highlight. So it's kind of a cheating of how lights work. But all you have to remember is either choose a Lambert or a Blinn. Most of the time it's going to be a Blinn, by the way. So now these are the materials and these are the attributes, and you can sort of read through the different bits. But basically, we've got color at the top, transparency. Ambient color is the way that light bounces around the surface. Incandescence is if it emits light. Bump map is like the detail, and we'll get into bump map. And then there's some diffuse, how it does, the material reflects light all over the surface, basically. And there's some translucency, which doesn't work that well, and it's really hard to manipulate. So I wouldn't really worry about the translucency values that much, but you can sort of play around with them, see how it works. Now, the big difference between Blinn and Lambert is this extra specular shading elements. So in here, we've got the ability to, make it more reflective and make it more shiny and so forth. So so just the way these elements control the highlights and so forth is really quite interesting, and we'll have to sort of play around with these to get the right sort of effect. So you can see that we're manipulating the highlight or shiny values with these sliders. Now, basically, there's lots of attributes here, but there's three main attributes that we have to worry about: color, bump, and specular color. So the exercise we're going to do today is creating this sort of stone material. And this really just focuses on those three attributes. And here's the graph. It's pretty straightforward and simple graph. We've got a marble texture for the color. We've got a cloud, but we'll probably use a volume fractal or something for the normal, as well as another noise pattern for the specular color. Now, the easiest way to do this is actually to work on the specular first, because it's really hard to see. And if you've got the color there already, you can't really tell where the specular is. So we're going to do that. Now, specular color or specular is just that reflective light over an object. So I just want to sort of demonstrate that now. I'm going to change over to my desk camera. All right. There we go. Okay, so here I've got some objects, and let's see. So basically, this hammer is quite a good example, if you can see that. And as you see, when I turn it, you can see as I turn the hammer, you can see the highlights on the object. Now the rust is quite rough, and it doesn't produce as much specular. But where there's indentations or rubbing of the metal, there's the extra bits of highlights. So that's kind of interesting as well with the handle as well. So I don't know if that's in focus. There we go. And as I turn the handle, you can see where my hand has been on this wood is really quite shiny. And it's not shiny in the grooves of the wood. Where we go, which is quite interesting. And of course, the black plastic, is super shiny. We've got like lots of, it's broken, so I've got some gaffer tape on there. So it's interesting on this object as well. So what we have is, a rusty old pan, cast iron, and most of it is not very shiny. But there are parts in it that just bring up some highlight on the corners and that sort of stuff. And that gives it, it makes it look really quite realistic. So these are the sort of things that we're trying to imitate. We're trying to imitate the variation in the shininess of an object to show that there's extra detail on the surface. And this sort of shininess is, evident on all sorts of materials. It's not just, metals. So here we've got like a really old suitcase. I think this is my grandfather's suitcase. He was into photography. So, and inside here, there's some different boxes and whatnot. And this box is kind of interesting. So what we have is, just a painted label. But on this label, there's little marks. I don't know if you can see that. It's hard to see in this. As I move it through the light, there's like this noise pattern on the side here where it's, obviously some sticky surface has got there, and then, fingerprints and a bit of dirt has made it less rough than the outside, so it's not as shiny. So you get that sort of variation. So what we're trying to do within 3D is really break up the surface to make it look more authentic and more realistic. And using noise patterns and specular color, in this case, we can break up how rough that surface is. So yeah, not only the noise patterns are great for specular, but you can see how the color is broken up in this, or the paint is breaking down, and we've got this like interesting sort of noise pattern in there as well. But yeah, the top of the suitcase, you can see as I move it, some of where the scratches are less shiny than other areas. So again, it breaks up the surface, and you can really see how the object looks three-dimensional. Three-dimensional. All right, so where are we? Here we go. Okay, so that's specular. The next thing is bump. Now, the bump is the extra little bits of detail. So with bump, we've got a couple of different things we can think about. We can think about just pure bump map, and a bump map is just a black and white values. There's also normal maps, which are color RGB values that influence the light and give you sort of shadows within these details. Or there's this displacement where we actually move the geometry. Bump is like the cheapest version of all this, but it's also really effective and very useful. And we can, if we use low values of this, we can really influence how the surface looks without extra cost or even extra geometry. So again, we got like little indentations and scratches and all sorts of stuff. And we use like a bump node. And then finally, we've got color. So again, the color sort of breaks down the surfaces, and we can get sort of variation. In this case, we're using like a marble procedural texture, which gives us two colors, and we can manipulate that. All right, so just want to show you some additional examples of looking at nature and finding these procedural textures in nature and noise patterns. And this picture of the Abbotsford Convent um, is a great example of those noise patterns and how they can be seen across a range of different surfaces. So not only within the breakdown of the paint, so how the paint is breaking down on the bricks, but also within the text itself. Up the top here, you can see sort of like these noise patterns coming through. Even the wood has variation in fading or detail, and you can see really evident the noise pattern in the wood across here, the rust, and so on. So it's kind of like everywhere. If we look at a detail, you can kind of see this happening here quite dramatically. Again, with the paint really peeling off. And inside, different rust patterns as well. So in here, you can see we've got variations of color, and you can break this up through different sort of strengths of noises and that sort of thing. So there's some nice examples again. And when you get more complicated, you can actually mask different materials. So you can have a really shiny metal and a really dull rust as part of the same material. And not only man-made stuff, but also within nature, you can sort of see these patterns everywhere. Once you start looking for them, they're actually you see them all over the place.